Hey, what's going on, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Alec Walt Show. I'm your host, Alec Walt, alongside the newest contributor to Down the Block Sports, Mr. Patrick Murnane. Patrick, welcome to Down the Block Sports, man. Well, your debut. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm looking to smash a couple home runs out of the park this one in my debut here. Let's get going. I'm excited.
You better not screw up.
I know.
This is going to be fun. We've done a lot of shows in the pen. We've done some fantasy baseball drafts. We've done all the work together, so I'm looking forward to advancing our baseball talents here on Down the Block Sports. So again, fantasy baseball, the baseball season's just around the corner. This is a big week for fantasy drafts, so we're going to help you guys out. Of course, on the Alec Walt Show today, we have a very special guest who covers fantasy baseball for The Athletic, Derek VanRiper. Derek, thank you very much for joining us today, man. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing really well. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing great, Patrick.
Oh, yeah. Love talking baseball. Any day I get to talk baseball is a good day.
Awesome. Well, right now we're going to talk fantasy baseball, getting you ready for the season. So, Derek, I want to start here at the top. Say this is one of the deepest top of the draft boards I've ever seen. Normally, you go into the draft, you get Mike Trout. Awesome. Well, you can still get Mike Trout this year, but possibly a little bit later in the first round. If you're on the clock right now, standard league categories, we'll just go with that for now. Who are you taking with that number one selection?
Well, until the injury that he suffered in a spring game on Tuesday, it was Fernando Tatis Jr. I think as we wait for more information, there's no reason to walk into that injury. So if I get those rankings updated for Wednesday, Ronald Acuna Jr. would be first on the board for me right now. There's not much that separates those two guys if they're both completely healthy. I think the thing that had Tatis ahead of Acuna for me is that Tatis hits the ball just a little bit harder. But you're talking about guys that should be plus contributors in at least 4 categories and probably 5, depending on where the batting average falls over the course of the season. I think a lot of people are really worried about stolen bases in general this year. So if you're picking near the beginning of round 1, prioritizing bats who give you 20 or 30 plus steals seems to be the way people want to go. And that's why we're seeing Mike Trout fall as far as 8th overall in some drafts. I mean, I couldn't believe that was happening during the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational, just a typical 5x5 league with an overall component. The fear that Mike Trout might only steal 6 or 8 bases over the full season seems to completely overwrite the fact that he's probably still the best all-around hitter in the game right now. And we're still just guessing that he's not going to run as much as he used to, in part because he ran less in the shortened season. It wouldn't surprise anybody if Trout found 18 or 20 steals this year, would it? I mean, he's still capable of doing that, even if he's not going to be the guy that runs as much as he did at his peak.
I mean, if we're talking Mike Trout here, I'm expecting that man can do it all. Like, yes, obviously 2020 was a weird year. We're going to mention some other former All-Stars who didn't really play too great in the shortened season a little bit later in the show. But one thing, because normally when you're in a fantasy baseball draft, fantasy football, doesn't matter what it is. If you get the number one pick, you feel like you're on an advantage. You get the best player. And yes, you still do in this situation, like you mentioned before, who you take at the number one pick. But when you look a little bit deeper into the first, early second round, you're seeing names like, Jose Ramirez, Freddie Freeman's 13 in Yahoo or something like that, which I think is disgustingly low. Are you at a disadvantage in 2021 with the depth at the top of the board if you get the number one pick?
Not necessarily. I think you could be in a position where, depending on who you're playing against and how aggressive they are with top-end pitching, you could get shut out on top 10 starters in some rooms. If you're in a 15-team league, it's possible that the top 10 starters are all gone before you get that second turn at pick 30 overall. But I still think if that happens, you're getting hitters that might be top 10 or top 15 hitters with your second and third pick. So I think there's a lot of ways to build a great roster this year. If I don't get enough pitching early, I'm comfortable taking some chances late. There are some really interesting young pitchers that are available in the back half of your draft. You can just load up with more of them, try to catch lightning in a bottle, and make up some ground on the teams that built with multiple aces. Pocket aces is a big deal this year for a lot of people. They want to get maybe pitchers in the first 2 rounds or at least 2 of the first 3 rounds, and that's probably as aggressive as the field has been with pitching since I started playing fantasy baseball.
Speaking of those pitchers going in those first few rounds, our guy Zach Gallen has just kind of gotten injured, forearm injury. That's a big red flag. We do not want to hear about that.
Oh, no.
So how far are you discounting him in your upcoming drafts until you know more about his situation?
Yeah, it's a good question because sometimes when we don't know how bad an injury is, there's a bit of a buying opportunity, but it comes with added risk because we could get really bad news on Zach Gallen at any point now. Forearm injuries can often be precursors to Tommy John. I would think the Diamondbacks are going to be careful with him because he's a big part of their future. So it seems almost certain to me that he's going to miss at least a couple starts when the season begins, that he's probably going to open the year on the IL. They're going to try and rest and rehab the injury. And maybe he comes back in April and takes the ball 27 or 28 times and ends up being a good value. If I were drafting right now, I think he'd have to fall probably into that 7th or 8th round range in a 15-team league, outside the top 100 overall before I would even start thinking about it. And I think the problem I'd still run into at that point in the draft is that there are plenty of players I like in that range. And there's guys that do everything. There are guys that steal bases. I love Victor Robles, for example. He goes in that range. Ramon Laureano is a solid player. Carlos Correa falls into that range. Chris Bryant's been falling into that range. Sometimes Matt Chapman's in that range. And you're talking about a lot of hitters there that don't share playing time with anybody. Maybe they're coming off of disappointing seasons a year ago, but they bring really nice ceilings in addition to stable floors. So it's just really hard to take a pitcher with an arm injury going up against really stable alternatives like that. So that's the discount I'm looking for on Gallen, and even then, the opportunity cost is probably still too high.
Well, I want to continue the conversation here on pitching because obviously in fantasy baseball, if you don't have good pitching, you're not going to win. In 2020, now that we're going from 60 to 162, we've been hearing a lot of conversations. Like specifically, I've heard a bunch on MLB Network Radio. You know, we're asking players and managers and general managers how they're going to manage the starting rotation. Now that it means that when you draft a pitcher early, there's a chance that there could be a week where they, skip a start. They manage innings. They get them ready. Maybe in the middle of the season, they take some time back to get them ready for September. There's a lot of question marks on how pitchers are going to be managed this season. So knowing that, what is your strategy for when and where to take starting pitching?
Yeah, so I'm not as worried about reduced workloads as everybody else seems to be. And I guess if you think about it just from a basic exercise and sports science standpoint, players went through the normal sort of off season, right? I mean, most players were able to start working out in November or December. They were throwing, they were working on pitches, they were doing cardio, they were lifting. By that point, things were normal. Things were weird last year, right? In the shutdown period from March until camp started to open back up, a lot of guys didn't have opportunities to throw at a normal gym. We saw guys building mounds in their own driveway and trying to find different ways to train. I feel like the worst of the injury concerns should have been played out in the shortened season. More weird things were likely to happen with the unusual ramp up to last season than are going to happen in the current one. What I think we do have to be mindful of is that young pitchers in particular, the guys that have never gone 180 plus, I mean, 200 is even like an unfair benchmark to set out there because fewer and fewer pitchers keep doing it. But the guys that haven't reached that maximum, take the ball every fifth day for a full season, the guys that haven't reached that yet, I think teams are going to proactively manage them more carefully, even if they don't necessarily have to do that. So I think the younger starters in particular at the top end, we're probably looking at guys like Tyler Glass now. Maybe Zach Gallen would have been a part of that even before the injury. Possibly a Corbin Burns. Like some of those guys might be held back occasionally when the schedule allows it, right? If you get a couple off days where you can skip a starter, maybe those younger guys miss a turn here and there. But usually I think that's going to come with a little bit of warning. And if it comes with some warning, you get to replace that player with someone on your bench. So I generally am trying not to overreact to these concerns because I think pitchers are built up and they're just as strong as they ordinarily would be. I don't think a previous year's workload is quite as important as we want it to be for the current year's workload, if that makes sense. So in leagues where people get over aggressive with pitching early, I'll sit back and I'll wait a little bit. I'll shop in the 15 to 30 range for my first couple starting pitchers. I'll build a rotation around Steven Strasburg and Jose Barrios and Sonny Gray and Chris Paddock. I'll find a combination of those guys that works for me if everybody else is just going wild, going for the top end arms.
You've got great Milwaukee Brewers hat on. And I just want to know what happened to Christian Yelich last year, and what do you think is going to result in the return? Is he going to be the normal Christian Yelich or half of what we've seen from him?
It's a fair question because he just didn't ever look right. And maybe we were dismissing that he ended his season in 2019 fouling a ball off his leg, and maybe physically he never quite felt right. But I think he was among the players who expressed some frustration with not having in-game video available. And I think the interesting thing about that is when you'd watch Yelich's at-bats last season, he seemed a lot more surprised by things that were happening within plate appearances than he did in the past. When Yelich is locked in, it looks like everything is going his way. It looks like he's hunting pitches, knowing exactly what he's going to get, knowing exactly how a ball is going to move. And that wasn't the case last year. The weird thing about him also, though, is that he didn't look right defensively. That's where I think the knee may have still been a little bit of a problem for him. So I'm giving him a pass in part because he hit the ball very hard, even when the K rate was up last year. The contact he was making was still elite contacts. The StatCast numbers are still good. The lineup around him is still solid. I think maybe we have to look at him as a guy that bounces back into the 24-25% range with his K rate. So maybe there's a little bit less batting average there than there was at his MVP peak a couple of years ago. But to me, I think we're going to look back at Christian Yelich's 2020 the same way that we're looking at Jose Ramirez's first half in 2019 right now, where it was just a really bad stretch from a really good player. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what he is going forward.
I want to stick in Milwaukee for a second because there's a infielder who's switching positions, Keston Hiura. Give me your thoughts on how that position change could affect him from a fantasy perspective.
It's nice to have a second base eligible player pick up first base eligibility early in the season. Gives you a little more flexibility to shuffle guys around. If someone gets hurt, you can play your best available option at first or second or middle or corner, depending on how deep your team is, and that always helps. The thing that I'm most curious to see with Hiura is that he was vulnerable to high fastballs last year. And I don't think of him as a guy with a slow bat, but he does have a toe tap and a leg kick. So I wonder if there's a timing mechanism in there that makes him more vulnerable to those pitches. Making an adjustment to your swing where you remove one of those things or possibly both of those things seems like something you'd have a hard time doing in season. It would take an off season's worth of adjustments to get that out and to still come back with the same kind of power that we've seen from Keston Hiura to this point in his young career. So I'm cautiously optimistic that if the Brewers didn't think that Keston Hiura could make some adjustments and continue to hit like he did when he debuted in 2019, they probably wouldn't have moved him to first base. I mean, you got to hit more at first base to stay in the lineup than you do at second base. So I look at that as maybe a vote of confidence from an organization that, yes, I'm a fan of them, but I think they're actually pretty smart. I think they do things more often than not in a way that is pretty logical. So I think with Hiura, a little bit like Yelich, we saw a lot of hard contact when he did make contact last year. It's just a question of how much he can bring that K rate down and how much he can either lay off the high fastball or start to catch up to those pitches and do a little bit of damage on them.
So one more on Milwaukee. Another fantasy player, your closer, Josh Hader. We saw a report today that he's going to play more of a traditional closer role. That back of the bullpen is absolutely disgusting in Milwaukee. I mean, he's going to be amongst the top closers. I think he's number one in my opinion. But, when is it too early to take a closer?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the format. So if you're playing in like a 10 or a 12-team league on Yahoo or ESPN, I don't know if I would necessarily want to go any earlier than round 5. I mean, I think if you're playing in a very high-stakes situation like the NFBC where there are no trades allowed, you have to get your saves during the draft. Otherwise, you're going to be chasing bad closers most likely on the waiver wire all season. They're very expensive in terms of fab. And paying up and getting him maybe in the 4th round of a 15-team league is actually appropriate depending on a lot of other factors, where you are in the draft order, what you've got on your roster so far. So at ADP, I think it's possible to pay up for Hader and not get punished for it too badly. It's a short list of closers that we really trust this year. I've got Hader, Liam Hendricks, Aroldis Chapman, and Raisel Iglesias as my top 4. Edwin Diaz, based on skills, belongs in that group, but he's had such a difficult time holding on to the 9th inning that I think he's kind of in the next wave with guys like Ryan Presley and Brad Hand and Kenley Jansen. It's probably as messy of a closer picture as it's been in the last 5 years, if not longer. So that little vote of confidence that Hader is going to be used as more of a traditional closer could actually make the price get to a point where I'm uncomfortable drafting him. If it's going to take a late 3rd or early 4th round pick to get Josh Hader, I think you're giving up too much value with the hitters and starting pitchers that are going in that spot to actually draft him there. So it's a really fine line to walk. I think it's unfortunately become very difficult to get quality closers at reasonable prices because there's so few of them available.
You work with some pretty experienced people. I'd say it's pretty smart people. And I'm just wondering which players that are being talked about in your circles.
Yeah, so I think the guy that I hear the most about is actually TJ Antone from the Reds. It seems like everybody loves him right now as a kind of a breakthrough pitcher in the back of that rotation. If he didn't have a rotation spot, he'd probably be a 90-inning or 100-inning reliever, and I think pitchers like that can actually be pretty valuable for us in fantasy this year. And maybe he moves between the two roles, and that adds plenty of value as well. I mean, there's some leagues that require you to use relief pitcher eligible players on your roster, right? And if you're getting starters innings from those slots at some points, that provides excess value compared to some of the short relievers that you throw in those spots instead. So he's been one of those guys that people are all over, and I think his ADP's probably shot up 100 picks since the time draft season started back in November and December. Some other names I'm trying to think about. Miles Straw has been coming up a little bit more recently. I don't see it. I think Houston maybe is showing us something a little bit different this week. I think Kyle Tucker just debuted in center field in a Grapefruit League game either Monday or it was on Sunday. But to me, it makes a lot more sense to play Tucker in center, keep Brantley in left, and maybe rotate guys like Aledmys Diaz and Abraham Toro and just find somebody else to play right. I feel like that gives them a better overall lineup than leaving Tucker in right and forcing Miles Straw out there in center. So I know cheap speed's hard to find, and that's part of the appeal with Miles Straw, but I think he comes with considerable playing time risk. So I'd be a little bit careful, expecting 30-plus steals from him. I think if he gets opportunities to play, it might be in more of a traditional fourth outfielder role as opposed to him taking over that center field job and holding on to it all season.
So you talked about Cincinnati before. I'm kind of happy you did that because they were a team that was kind of all over the place. Like they had a really good rotation, but their team wasn't amazing. Eugenio Suarez struggled last year. So did Mike Moustakas. We saw Nick Castellanos, one of the hottest players at the beginning of the season, then kind of cooled off a little bit. Are you buying a fantasy bounce back from the offense in Cincinnati this year?
I am. I talked to Clay Link of RotoWire about this on one of our shows a couple weeks ago, and he wasn't quite as bullish on the entire offense as I was. He suggested that while they've done a lot to make their pitching a lot better, they've got that relationship with Driveline, and Kyle Bodie's on staff there, and Derek Johnson, the pitching coach, has done a really good job, that they might be missing something on the hitting side. But I liked what they did going into the last offseason. I know they were a team that had some issues with players missing some time with COVID-related concerns early last season. When I look at this team, I see Suarez as a guy that has easy 40 home run power. Rabbit ball or not, like he has big time power. Moustakas to me is an easy 30 home run guy in that park. Castellanos I would say is the same, but with probably a better batting average floor than Moose. So I see all three of those guys where they're going right now. I think they're a little bit undervalued as a group, and probably my favorite young hitter this year at price is Nick Senzel. I keep getting him all over the place. We saw power, we saw speed in 2019. I know his 2020 was pretty ugly, but Senzel was an early first rounder, a guy that hit everywhere in the minors, and because he could be at least a 15-15 guy, if not a 20-20 guy, I think he's undervalued as someone who doesn't really ever go inside the top 200 overall.
Beautiful. I love the Reds. We were talking about before, we were talking about some sleeper players. I've got some ideas of ones. Like I like Jose Urquidy, and I think Alec Baum also is a really good sleeper. Are there any more that you could think of? Maybe Walt, do you got any?
Well, how about we mentioned a lot of hitters here other than Urquidy. Who do you like on the pitching side? Because again, that's where I'm going to be looking for a lot of depth because, if you can add those 3 or 4 extra starters late in the draft, you are going to dominate your league.
Yeah, Urquidy is definitely a popular sleeper. I think he'd kind of fit into that conversation we were having before. Everybody seems to like him, so the price is going up. I would say I even like him more than TJ Antone because there's really no concern about innings. I think with Urquidy, people realized pretty quickly that his shortened 2020 brought us a lower K rate than expected. This is a guy that's got 4 pitches in command. He's going to at least strike out 20% of the batters that he faced. He's not going to walk a lot of guys. You're probably getting a sub-4 ERA and a good whip. And as much as everybody wants to trash Houston, understandably so, they're still good. It's a good team. Like they're going to provide run support. They've got a decent bullpen protecting leads. At least have a couple really top shelf relievers to protect leads in close games. Maybe their bullpen depth is a problem, but I think Urquidy could end up being one of their best starters. I mean, Greinke's kind of in a tier of his own right now, and people pay a lot for Lance McCullers. But if you told me today that Urquidy's going to be better than McCullers in 2021, I probably wouldn't argue back. They could both be good, and Urquidy could just be the guy that kind of gets you more innings and possibly gets you even more strikeouts because of the difference in workload. But other sleeper pitchers, I mean, I'm still interested in Tarek Skubal. I know his debut wasn't great, but look at his minor league numbers. I mean, he was just overpowering hitters everywhere he pitched. The Tigers have nothing to lose by running him out there every fifth day all season. So I think we get an easy 150 innings from him. If we get to even 170 innings from Skubal, he's capable of striking out 200 guys with that workload. And I think the ratios are going to be much, much better than what we saw in that debut. He suddenly had a home run issue upon arrival in the big leagues. I don't think that's going to be a core part of his skills going forward. So he's definitely one of my targets in the later rounds. I would say Freddie Peralta is still a guy that I'm interested in. I think the Brewers are doing a good job stretching him out this spring. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he actually broke camp as a starter, given how much he's throwing this spring. They could either have him switch spots with Josh Lindblom or with Adrian Hauser. So I think Freddie, with the deeper arsenal especially, has become a lot more interesting than he was when he debuted. It was mostly fastball, fastball, fastball when he first came up. Now we're starting to see the development of a slider that's really good. And I think if he gets a changeup that's working too, he could actually be the number 3 starter for the Brewers by season's end.
Nice. There you go. Well, another question I have. So last year, Randy Arozarena was traded from the Rays, or to the Rays from the Cardinals, and he got called up and just took off. You know, for anyone in fantasy baseball who was able to pick him up in a standard league, you had someone that was extremely productive for the second half of the season. Now, obviously, from 60 games to 162, it's going to be much more spread out depending on time-wise, but who is that guy, that Randy Arozarena, that you may not draft, but when you look back in September, you say, thank God I picked this guy up because he was an absolute superstar?
Yeah, it's always a fun question to think about. It's really got to be somebody who's blocked right now, and it's not even a question of skills. It's just a matter of time before the opportunity opens up. I've wondered if we've been underrating Ha-Seong Kim in San Diego. I know they've got a ton of depth there, but if you look at what he was doing in the KBO, if he came in this year and just locked down the second base job in San Diego and they let Cronenworth and Profar be the 2 utility guys and just move those guys all over the place, would it really surprise us that much if Ha-Seong Kim was an early round pick in 2022? I guess he's kind of increasingly becoming that guy because the initial draft day price was much higher than what we're seeing right now. I think people are worried about how crowded it is in San Diego instead of focusing on the skills. So I'm going to make him my Randy Arozarena pick for 2021. It's almost impossible to make a call like that, but it's certainly fun to try.
Speaking of I'm thinking about how do you balance the expectations of a team with the skills of a player? For instance, how are you going to balance Jose Ramirez's RBI thoughts? However, the team is not what it used to be. So in your head, do you knock him down?
A little bit. I think the key for a guy like Ramirez is that he has those steals to fall back on. So if his counting stats suffer a little bit because Lindor's not there and Andres Jimenez is good, but he's not quite Lindor production-wise, that does impact the other players in the lineup. You know, that does hurt Jose Ramirez in terms of his RBI potential. It's a slight downgrade if it's a downgrade at all. I think we've probably gone through something similar in Boston, right? I mean, the Red Sox lineup with Mookie Betts versus the Red Sox lineup with Alex Verdugo at the top. Like, Verdugo's a nice player. He gets on base a lot, but he's not Mookie Betts. So the ceiling that we had for J.D. Martinez a couple years ago as a great run producer is probably just a little bit lower than it was before. But even with that, I love J.D. Martinez where he's going because we're not paying a second round or third round pick to get J.D. anymore. We're looking at him as a guy that falls into the 7th or 8th round of some drafts. So it is all about, you know, what the market is doing with players like that. I think you do want to account for team situations. I mean, Trevor Story, I think, gets a slight downgrade just like Ramirez does, relatively speaking, because you lose Nolan Arenado. And you could shuffle guys around. So, sure, Ryan McMahon plays third base for Arenado, and you put Brendan Rodgers in the lineup once he's healthy. Brendan Rodgers could be a really nice player. I like him as a bit of a deep sleeper, but he's probably not going to be Nolan Arenado, and that's going to hurt Trevor Story's production at least a little bit. So it is important to account for those changes in terms of team context. But I also want to make sure I'm not overreacting to them either, because the market sometimes corrects and it corrects too far. And there's sometimes a buying opportunity that opens up as a result.
So, Derek, before we let you go, how can our listeners follow you on social media, and where can they get access to your articles?
Yeah, at Derek VanRiper on Twitter, on The Athletic, all of my rankings, any articles I write, everything's up there. A couple podcasts, Rates and Barrels, The Athletic Fantasy Baseball Podcast, Fantasy Baseball in 15. I got pictures of my dog on Instagram, so you can search for me on Instagram if you like pictures of cute dogs. I got a golden doodle, Hazel. She's pretty great. So if you're into that, that's where all that content goes.
All right, Derek VanRiper, fantasy baseball expert for The Athletic. Really appreciate your time today and joining the Alec Walt Show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys.
All right, well, that's going to be it for this episode of the Alec Walt Show. I'm Alec Walt alongside Patrick Murnane and Derek VanRiper. Who are you taking this year in fantasy baseball? Feel free to comment that below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Down the Block Sports. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and best of luck in your fantasy baseball drafts.